Welcome everybody. Thank you for the part 3 of this series of webinars by Harold. There's chat. If you ask questions, then I will ask Harold. So everybody's muted, just otherwise it can be a bit of interference with the audio. If you do want to ask a question, then if you just put it in the chat, and then I will ask Harold. Harold, do you want me to stop you in flow to ask questions, or do you want to kind of pause and then say,
I've got the group chat open. I've got the chat open, and I think really what we want to do today, as far as possible, is not just for all of you to listen to me, but I'm hoping that you may have had a chance to go out and try doing a little bit of recording and now have questions about what any difficulties that you've come up against. I also have some advice I can give about logistics and running a project and some of those things, which I realise haven't gone out as a set of advice. I thought they had, but in fact a set of advice that seems to have never quite been updated and linked to all the other updated advice. So I've just been looking at that this morning and realizing that it doesn't exist. So I was deciding what I was going to talk about today, if anything, because I think your questions are more important, and what I could just point to existing resources for. Actually, some of the logistics stuff hasn't gone out to you, so I will update that. I'll send it to Caring for God's Acre who can adapt it to go up onto their site. I'll send some to Debs for them to put up on theirs, and Andrea can also send a copy out to all of you in the format I send it to her, so you've got that straight away. So apologies for that. I don't know how it fell through the system, but some of that may come up in what I talk about today or questions that you raise. So that will allow you to think about how you roll this out on a sort of more communal scale at whatever stage that may prove possible. So I think the main thing today is to answer questions, and Paul and Penny have already sent me some questions, which I'm ready to answer, but I think it would be helpful really if we had other questions, because I told them I can easily respond to them in email, and they are quite specific. Well, one of them I think is quite an interesting generic question, but let's see whether other people have the same sorts of issues, if they've managed to do anything, or if you've already run up against even logistical problems. Perhaps we can discuss whether there are ways around them. So if anyone wants to ask a question, I don't know where, Andrea, if you've got everybody on one screen, or are we on to two screens now, aren't we just?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Harold, can we just check that everybody's seen part 2 so they kind of know the forms that we're now going to be referring to in this webinar? Has everybody watched part 2 and know the forms that we're going to be chatting and asking questions about? If people put their hand up, I'll scroll through. Oh yeah. Oh look, Rena's got a posh thumbs up there.
Thumbs up. Oh yeah.
Oh nice.
Real expert. There, look at that. Yeah.
Oh, I want a thumbs up like that. Ah, and Rosie and Sue. Actually, it's all the females that can do this snazzy thumbs up. Guys, you're lagging way behind.
I know. Yeah.
Okay.
All that. So I'll give you all a clap.
No, you are showing off. Okay, I'm gonna.
I don't know how I can get rid of it now, so I don't know how it seems to be stuck there now. But anyway, anyway, never mind about that.
Okay, so I'll
sure
mute myself.
All the way through.
I'm going to mute myself then.
Okay.
And I'll see you later.
And if anybody wants to then ask a question, does anybody have any feedback of trying to use the system and succeeding or failing? We can all be quite honest today. You may not have had a chance to get out and do it, but I think it's helpful for even those of you that haven't, if those of you that have could comment on whether you managed to do it, or whether you found it very confusing or very slow or whatever. And it's also useful for us in our feedback, in this feedback, to think about how we might moderate any of our training or any of our advice. So does anybody want to say anything at this stage? Anybody got any comments? I'd like to just unmute and say something if you want to say something.
Hello, Harold. It's Tim Norman. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a couple of observations, really. Firstly, your knacks for looking at the inscriptions in different light levels is very useful. At one stage I couldn't read it until I went there when the sun was setting and you got a bit of a shadow in the inscriptions. That was quite useful. Another strange thing for me was a fellow a church in a nearby village, from a grave from sort of it was about 1870, seemed to have his occupation on the top left and top right of the gravestone, i.e. a set square, a hammer, as if he was a builder or a carpenter. So I thought was quite strange. I've not seen that. Is that quite typical, do you think?
That may be craft symbols, but they're often also Masonic symbols.
Yeah, this is
quite a lot.
This was very much a set square, a set square like a ruler that a carpenter would put in with. So it didn't seem Masonic.
Yeah, that's one of that's a Masonic symbol. Yes.
Is it? Oh, okay.
Yes. So that it may well, and they often do go at the top. These Masonic symbols, sometimes in the middle and sometimes sort of on the shoulders of the stone, you get them. They're very common actually in Scotland, but you get them across the British Isles, and you also get them on the continent, on where stones do survive, and particularly actually in North America. So Masonic symbols are quite common. Sometimes some of the other organizations also have symbols which appear on some stones, but it's the Masons that are the most common. But of course, because they're also occupational symbols, sometimes they occur on stones belonging to people, who are actually carpenters or whatever. But normally they are Masonic. So that's what those are.
Okay.
There are quite a range of Masonic symbols that appear on gravestones, but those are some of them. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm glad the lighting tips helped you. Yeah. So I've got a few comments here. Right. So Ruth's got something to say. So I don't know whether you want to actually expand on that, Ruth, if you'd like to.
Okay, dokes. I was on a course, actually it was the year before last, I think now, time has zoomed past so fast. And I went with Dufford Archaeological Trust.
Yes.
And we did actual plotting and used their forms, which are very similar to yours. Actually, yours have got a few more bits of information and they're much more beneficial. So I will adapt the information I've recorded on the Dufford forms and use yours. But on the whole,
I expect the ones they had.
Sorry?
So I expect the ones they were using, if it was that long ago, were based on my previous version of the forms and coding. So that'll be why there's a difference. Yeah. Yeah. So that's pre-upgrade. So you're all getting the benefit of the latest cutting-edge versions, you see. So that's good. But I'm glad people coped. Was there a group of you doing it?
Me and my husband doing the plotting, and then I did the photography. We were going, and trouble is because I don't speak Welsh, and a lot of the stones were in Welsh. And although we'd got some translations, some of them were just impossible to translate myself. So I was sending stuff off to other people within the church who were Welsh speakers to translate. But really enjoyed doing it and want to get up there again when weather permits.
Yes, I've done quite a bit of work. I don't know whether you know, but I've done quite a bit of work in Pembrokeshire myself with the Dufford Archaeological Trust. So and also doing graveyard recording in North Pembrokeshire. So and so I'm very used to the issues of bilingualism on the memorials. Yes. And the potential that they offer, actually, though I'm not a Welsh speaker either. But a lot of the parts at the bottom are, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of Wales, there are a lot of biblical quotations, which of course you can check against sort of online sources. You also get some hymns. I've managed to trace some as clearly hymns, Welsh hymns, that are some of the texts. But yes, having a Welsh speaker is good. Though some of the texts, even modern Welsh speakers find problematic because the language is quite different.
Well, and the spelling as well, so, because it hasn't been, well, even now it's still debate as to how things are spelt and and pronounced, depending on where you are in the country.
Yes.
So.
And that everybody, including the older English stones that people may be recording, will have may have what to us seems very strange spelling, and sometimes rather variable abbreviations. And some of those are based on a sort of transcription of what they were told to write, rather than copying from a written down version. So you get these dialects coming out in the earlier inscriptions through the texts. So that's something to look out for if you have some, sort of particularly sort of middle and earlier 18th century stones. You might well get some interesting dialect type phrasing on the memorials. So it's something to look out for. And one of the things which my system is not designed to capture, because it just so much depends on what you want to study from and research from the gravestones, is how you analyze the inscription texts. So most of my structure is about the form and decoration of the memorials. And although you're transcribing the text, that is not a sort of major part of the sort of data entry into any system. And when we were on the DEBS project, we spent a long time talking about this and doing a little bit of researching around on the state of play on it. And the problem is that at the moment, there is no easy way of creating a sort of database of this information that can be interrogated effectively once you've got it. So if you type all the inscriptions into a Word document, well, you could search for individual words or something, but it's quite difficult to search under any category like occupation or anything like that, or relationship terms, mother, husband, whatever it might be. So it's really difficult to know how to actually organize all that data. There are ways that people have done it with sort of classical inscriptions, which involves a very complex form of flagging all the individual words with all the sort of pointers as to what they might be searched for. But this is incredibly labor intensive and only still covers the things you thought of when you started doing that process. So in a sense, at some point, when sort of AI gets to a certain level of complexity, there'll be something else to do with a lot of these texts that we collect. But at the moment, the only way of doing it is by having a spreadsheet yourself where you code it that you've done that. So I've in the past, for particular projects where I've been looking at a particular aspect, such as husband, wife, daughter, all those types of things and their relationships, I've had to code those and mark them up for each bit of the inscription, because obviously on a stone there might be several sets of bits of inscription. So it's again very complicated how you subdivide all that up in order to do any analysis. And again, that is quite a big job and then is not easily transferable to another place, because somebody else might have data which shows things in a different light. You know, maybe there aren't many mentions of children or whatever it is, and it wouldn't be what you'd want to study. So the inscriptions are really a question of you deciding how you might want to explore them yourselves, and then devising a system that allows you to go through systematically and collect the information you want. So that may seem a bit disappointing. In fact, some of the Welsh, mainly Welsh biblical verses, I analysed for a couple of graveyards in North Pembrokeshire. A few of them were in English, and a lot of the biblical quotations were in Welsh, even if the rest of the memorial was in English. And these were most probably the biblical texts used for the funeral sermon. And so it was very interesting analysing them all to see what the sort of emphasis in those particular verses were, you know, whether it was a life cut short, whether it was about suffering, whether it was about resurrection, what it was about. And so that was a very interesting study, but you couldn't really sort of formulate a model for everybody to use across the whole country for that, because it would just get too complicated to have too many sets of coding for too many questions. It was quite interesting because one person turned out that the biblical text was all about adultery. So you do wonder what the funeral sermon was like for that particular individual. But anyway, so it does throw up some interesting lines of inquiry, but you can't obviously have a sort of system that works across the whole spectrum of possible questions as well. So I'm not saying that those aren't sort of very valid and interesting ways of investigating your data. It's just that the main classificatory part of the recording isn't the way to capture it. When you're actually transcribing all these inscriptions, you will notice things about them that might be really interesting, and then you've got to think your own way of working through that evidence and seeing what's going on. Okay, got some more things. Oh yes, Masonic symbols are coming up here. Yeah. So that's good. So so I'm glad people are happy enough so far. We haven't got anything. I haven't got any complainers yet. The complainers perhaps might not have come back for the third session, Andrea. That may be where they've gone. They've voted with their attendance. So does anybody have anything else they would like to either put in a chat or just unmute and have a word? You're all being very coy. So I'm hoping, let's just see how many of you have managed to go out and actually have a go at doing the system. I know it's been a very busy time and the weather hasn't always been terribly clement. So how many of you have actually managed to go out and have a go so far? And we've got a nice thumbs up there. Many others? Yeah. A few more. So yeah, if we've got quite a lot, Andrea, that haven't had a chance to do it yet, we might think about having another Zoom session at some point where people can come for a sort of query session later on. You can always send me the list if everyone's happy with that, and then I can sort of just set up a separate little surgery at some point, because quite a few questions are the ones that, you know, people the same questions come up quite often. Having done a few, you know, in-person sessions, and you wander around the graveyard to the different people, you know, having a go at doing the recording, you know, the same questions keep coming up. And obviously my advice has tried to capture as many of those as possible, but then that makes the advice quite unwieldy, and I'm sure some of you have lost the will to live reading all my advice if you have tried, and that it's getting the balance between trying to cover everything and give you all my experience that's I think's worth having, and also making it accessible to you without feeling you've got to read War and Peace before you can get out into the graveyard. So that's the sort of challenge, really, of the advisory documents. So,
can I say a question?
Yes. Helen?
Helen Franklin. Yes, I'm very new to this, and I was recently a church recorder for our local Art Society group. But the Art Society in London now have finished with church recording, and I just came across this and thought this might be a new project that we redundant church recorders could take on. But I perhaps have missed the basic reason for doing it. Do you record a graveyard for the parish, or is it for some other reason?
Well, I've recorded them partly for the parish, but I'm doing it to answer questions about, you know, the cultural evidence for that place through the last couple of centuries mainly. So I have a sort of academic local history, archaeology sort of set of reasons. But it's also extremely useful for the parish to have a set of records. So it works both ways round. And in fact, one of the questions that Penny and Paul asked was, is this linked to the Church of England's plans for recording memorials in churchyards? And the answer is yes, but I was there first. Okay, so the point is they have set up a plan that they should all be recorded, and this includes mapping them, but they are pushing that being done with a commercial organisation who the parishes have to pay to get a plan and so on done, and for a lot more money they will also do a form of record, though not as detailed as the one in my methodology, of the memorials. So but what I am offering is part of it's on the Church of England now advice pages as a link, as a way to record the graveyard, and it is something which ideally would be then noted as having happened on the church care system, if some of you know about that, which is the Church of England and now Wales as well, Church of Wales as well, they've come in on it, I think, system which notes what's been done in terms of researching and recording the building, but also now the burial ground. So in that sense, it is useful. The parishes find it useful. It particularly, obviously, the most obvious thing is that they get lots of inquiries about who's buried in the graveyard. So the person database is often the most useful from the parish's point of view, but it's also very valuable if it's identifying particularly important memorials and feeds into their management scheme, which is more how I'd come to caring for God's Acre through the sort of idea, how do we manage our graveyard and how do we interpret it and how do we make it useful for the congregation but also the community, and how we can integrate cultural heritage with natural heritage, which, you know, Andrea would be sort of interested in, and it's how the whole thing becomes a coherent whole. So the idea is that it's for both, and by having a system that is standard, it means that the data can be used by lots of different people and combine data and compare data from different places.
Right. So a record done would go to the Church of England and just the parish, or do you
go to the parish? But we have for the digital version of the data, we have an arrangement, though it involves a cost, because they then archive it in perpetuity, for it to be deposited with what's called the Archaeology Data Service.
Right.
And so that they then house the data and make sure that whatever changes there are to all the sort of computer systems all of us have, it will still work and be accessible and work on people's software and things. Whereas the problem in the past, so for example, a lot of my Pembrokeshire data, my North Pembrokeshire data I was talking about before, was recorded in the 1980s, the first phase of it, and that is all on big floppy disks that go into a BBC Micro, which some of you may or may not remember. But of course, it is now, I still have my BBC Micro, in fact, in this very office, under a big blanket, being preserved should I ever need to access that data again. And I just hope it will keep waking up every time I plug it all in and start it up. But at some point, those disks will be just corrupted through corrosion, and my BBC Micro will no longer wake up again. And then all that data will be lost forever. Okay, and I have no way at the moment of transferring it onto something else, like those small floppy disks that none of the students know about or whatever. And CDs don't last forever, they also degrade. So the idea is to send it to the Archaeology Data Service, because the Church of England doesn't have a digital storage facility, so that it will then be accessible freely to everybody and in perpetuity. So that's the system. But obviously, having a printed set, a paper set that goes to the parish, would be really useful. And it may be that some diocesan record offices would be prepared to take a set. You'd have to ask them. I did a survey for Historic England a few years ago, asking record offices as well as cemetery and parochial organization, arrangements for archiving of material, and there was a lot of gaps. A lot of places were not prepared to accept these records, which is one of the reasons why we went through this planning of a system which would allow at least digital archiving. Yes. So this is a bit like the NADFAS equivalent of doing churches. Okay.
Yes.
So it has that, and it can be done by the same sort of people who are doing NADFAS.
Yes.
And in fact, I have worked in a number of places with people who are concurrently doing NADFAS, if you see what I mean, and it's worked fine. So if your NADFAS people would like to do it, that would be absolutely brilliant. And if NADFAS would like to get in touch with me and have some sort of linking on that, then I would be very happy to help them out, because I think NADFAS are fantastic, and this would be another dimension to our appreciation of our ecclesiastical heritage as a whole.
Yes. Oh, well, great. Well, I'll look into that as well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Good.
Put me right, so I can tell the group now.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. That's right. And so that's also answers one of Paul and Penny's queries. So how you do your mapping, for which there is advice on the advice documentation that already exists, is up to you. But a map of some sort is essential if you're doing a proper survey, simply because people can then go back to the relevant memorials. And that's, again, one of the things that parishes often need, is because people want to know where a particular grave is. Now, obviously, these are only the marked graves. The parish may have maps which also show all the unmarked graves, particularly from recent times. And it may be that a copy of that map is something you then just expand to include all the memorials where they don't have them on, or they don't have anything about it on, because they don't know who's in those graves, and you can be able to work from that map onwards. But the point is that the memorial location is absolutely a crucial piece of information for various forms of analysis, but also for other people to be able to go and find particular memorials. I don't know whether any of you have had some of those really irritating sets of genealogists' transcriptions where they've recorded all the gravestones from a particular site, and then they order them by the surname of the person on the stone, the surname of the person, and they produce the list like that and don't tell you where any of the stones are. in the graveyard. So you go to a graveyard of 500 memorials, and you know there is a 1720 stone. You don't know anything about the decoration because they haven't bothered to record anything. You don't know whether it's a tomb or a headstone. You don't know anything about it at all, except that it's 1720s, and you think it might well be interesting. And you know the surname and the name of the person on it, and you haven't a clue where to go, and you're wandering around trying to eye up anything that looks like it might be an early memorial. Well, that's not very helpful for anybody. So it's amazing how some of the stuff that already exists has its limitations in terms of other sorts of uses. It was just designed for people who were trying to find their ancestors' name and dates, and not really follow it up in any other way. So that's an example of where this rather more comprehensive recording system, which some of you might think is overly elaborate, means that for a lot of people then their queries can be answered, or if not answered, they can be answered by them going and locating the stone. But the advice documentation is quite good at telling you, well, I hope it is good, it's quite comprehensive about telling you the various sort of levels of technology and detail of how to do a graveyard plan. And obviously one of those options is to pay someone to do it, and create a sort of accurate measured plan. And you can do that through the people that are recommended and with the Church of England. But you may also want to see if you can get quotes from your conservation architect, may be able to get one done. I'm on the York DAC, and several of the conservation architects there who have to do work on the churchyards get local sort of laser scan surveyor people in who just sort of set up a machine and it spins around on its own and records the plotting of the whole of the graveyard, and that can be quite relatively inexpensive. And also you can get local archaeological units to do it. They're used to doing these things and they could give you a quote. So if you have any funds and that's what you want to spend your funds on, then there are various options, of which only one would be the Church of England people. So you might want to look into those options rather than just assuming there's only one way of doing it. But it's quite easy for a group of people to do their own planning. It's not as complicated as you might fear. So, but it's really is very, very, very useful to have a sort of at least moderately accurately mapped site plan to help people locate the memorials. That's something that I've discovered over the years that's nothing worse than not being able to locate them again.
Harold, Penny asked, can you give us a ballpark figure on how much mapping a graveyard might cost?
Not really, no. It would be a few £100s, or it might be tipping into four figures, because much depends on how big it is and how complicated it is to do, in the sense that does it have lots of bushes and different parts of it, has it got extensions that mean that not only is it very big with a lot of memorials in it, but also when you set up your equipment, it can only see so much of it. So you've then got to move your equipment to be able to see and survey another. So it's you may think, well, I should be able to give you an estimate just off the top of my head, but it is actually quite difficult to do that because there are so many factors that influence, the amount of time the people doing the survey have to spend on the site. And some of the ones that they do now with this particular group used by the Church of England, but also, and some dioceses within the Church of England are having all their graveyards done by them. And other commercial surveyors now is to use a drone, and then the drone takes lots of images, and then someone back at base creates all that into a map. But of course, that still means they've got to go back and ground truth under trees and in places where the drone hasn't been able to get to for whatever reason, including potentially, near overhead lines or whatever it might be. So there can be lots of reasons why there are gaps, and indeed I know some people who still are refusing to pay for the approved Church of England People's Survey because they haven't gone back and added in the stones they didn't manage to get through their automatic systems. So you need to have you need to be sure that your map really has mapped everything before you pay out. So that's a bit of advice I can give you based on experience, whoever you get to do it. Okay, so but doing it yourselves is quite possible.
There's also a question from Susan Amos saying, what about when notable graves have been destroyed and then renewed?
Yes, you do get this. There are quite a number of them. There are various sorts of new graves that are for old interments. There are ones where there was a stone, it's got rather decayed and it's been replaced. That's one category. And it may have been replaced by something that sort of mimics what was there before, or maybe just completely new sort of design. There's ones where someone famous died. They may or may not really know where that person's buried, but they put a memorial up. And then there are also ones to people who are of a category that didn't get memorials. So I know, and I'm actually quite interested in both ones for unbaptized children and for mariners lost at sea, where in more recent times, people may have decided there ought to be a memorial either, and then with either named people on it or just to a category of person who had not previously commemorated. Now, if there is one with a named particular person, which is clearly a replacement stone, my coding system does allow that to be highlighted. So you record it as normal, but in the reasons what date you think it is, there is one that's about it being a new stone. So in other words, it might be to someone who died in the middle of the 18th century, but it's actually a late 20th century memorial. And so you would note, you might not know exactly when it went up, but you can see it's clearly not an 18th century memorial. And so you would use the appropriate coding on that. And therefore, if you were looking at the data and trying to see what shapes were around when, that information would highlight that stone shouldn't say, oh yes, shiny black granite was being used by people in Dorset in 1740. You know, because it would highlight that it was not a stone that, although it's commemorating someone who died then, it was not a stone that went up anywhere near the time that person died. Okay, does that help you answer the question? Sometimes now people are putting little plaques on memorials. So it is the original memorial, and it may have a very weathered inscription on it, but they then stick on a plaque, sometimes repeating the inscription, sometimes with something new, sort of reinforcing that is the place where a particular person is buried. So I'm not sure that's perhaps the best way of, from a sort of heritage point of view, doing that, especially on the front, covering up part of the inscription. But it's certainly what I've seen happen in quite a number of cases recently. And of course, the memorials do belong to the descendants of the people who put the stone up. They don't belong to the church, which has sometimes caused some problems with conservation work on memorials that the church feel need to be restored, either because of their significance or because of safety. And some places have found that rather challenging. But in fact, there has been plenty of advice now that can be done after some notification has gone up and no one objects. But so if people choose to do things to their stone, if it's their family stone, then sadly we can't necessarily do anything about that. And some people like cleaning their stones, sometimes very aggressively, in a way which will actually speed up their erosion. So you may find some of that when you do your surveys, that there are some marble monuments, for example, that are now gleaming white, and then you discover that they were erected in the 1920s and they look as good as new. well, they look as good as new, but they may well erode much more quickly than the ones perhaps around them that are looking rather sort of algae covered, which have not been cleaned up. But on the other hand, they were originally very white. Okay, and that's one of the questions that often comes up most when people are out survey is, what's this made of? It can't be white marble because it's not white. So that's something very much to look out for, is those marble ones that are slightly eroded, discolored, and often covered with a sort of algal. Andrea will no doubt be able to give me the technical description of what it is growing on them or whatever, but don't clean it off. That's the main message. Don't clean it off. Anything else? Oh, here we are. What have we got here? Closed churchyards. Yeah. Closed churchyards. They also deserve to be recorded. They can be closed and still be surrounding a church that in use. It can be closed in that sense, or it can be a sort of largely abandoned type closed. So there are various categories of closed churchyards, but the main thing is to find out, if you for permission, who you get permission from, which I have found extremely difficult for some Welsh nonconformist burial grounds where the chapels seem to have completely gone and no one seems to be really terribly responsible for them anymore. So I think some of you may find it challenging if they really are sort of closed, come abandoned in some cases. But most Anglican ones should have some sort of sense of continuity of responsibility, and therefore those are the people you should be able to track down who you get permission from in order to do a survey. If it's closed and rather overgrown, you've then got to also think about the logistics of how you do the recording if it's in a terrible state, and that is a big challenge in some cases. Okay, is that Robin wanting to say something?
Yeah, Harold. Sorry, just let me take the phone off the hook. Hang on. I'm just going to say that we've got a closed churchyard. It's been closed since 1884. And when the West Middlesex Family History Society came to ask to do it, we were very happy for them to do their survey. But of course, we also had to get permission from the council, because closed churchyards, the normal pattern is that since whenever it is the legislation in, I think, the 1930s, local councils are supposedly responsible for the upkeep of the closed churchyards. So that's one thing you need to care of. As far as the actual memorials are concerned, this issue about how you read a fairly illegible inscription, mud and flour were two of the things that the Historical Society people used to help bring up the inscriptions, which is quite interesting. I mean, obviously there's the issue of what light you do it in, but apparently putting some wet mud on the gravestone helps, as does using some flour. The other thing to say was that we're just embarking on a building project which will move out into the churchyard, and it's been really helpful to have the survey that we've had done, because we're going to have to move a number of the graves, and as you rightly say, the graves actually are owned by the families. We've got to find out whether any of the graves from the 19th century, there are still surviving relatives around. But because we've got the survey with all the details of names and things, members of our church recording group are actually doing the research to see whether they can track anybody. So
yes, and you can also do that, through the faculty notice process, where you put up a notice with the names of the families, or do an item, in a public place which lists those, and if you give sufficient notice, that can another be a way of covering you legally that you have made all reasonable consultation for people to object.
We also had to help the Historical Society in two ways. One, we had to do a little bit of clearing of, what shall I say, vegetation in some places so that they could read some of the more obscure descriptions. And also we had, I think, 7 headstones actually lifted up and turned over so that they could be read. They'd obviously been lowered over the years for safety reasons, and they were actually being lowered so that they were face down.
Yes.
We've still got 9 of our 390 memorials, which we've not got any information on. There wasn't certainly no inscription. So we're still working out whether we can find a mason's mark or anything on them to see if we can.
I think that's highly unlikely.
Yeah,
highly unlikely.
We're using the sexton's records from the 19th century, where every single grave or burial was mentioned, but of course not exactly in the sort of scientific way that you have got.
Yes, and I think the chances of you being able to do that, track them down is quite slim, but it's worth a try. You never know. But I think one of the things that's quite interesting. I mean, I agree with you about the local authorities. It just depends what closed means. So you'll find out for your particular place what the legal category of closed is, because some churches then pass them over to local authority use. Some have not, because they want to retain their own degree of management and are prepared to pay for the cost of upkeep in the way because they haven't handed it over. So they've not all been handed over, and some local authorities make it more difficult for people to hand them over than others. So because they obviously don't want to pick up the cost. So that is something that you will have to you'll have to find out with your individual case. But again, whoever is responsible for it, you will need to have the permissions from, and that is an important part of the process of setting up a proper project. I mean, if you're just going in on your own and looking at some of the headstones, that's a different matter altogether. But if you're setting up an organized survey, then you need to obviously have all the necessary permissions, and you need to find out whether those people who are managing it would or would not like a set of the records and all the rest of it in order to, and some of them will and some of them might not want to have them, but that's their choice. And the same will be true of parishes, and it may be true of local authorities in terms of how they're interested in going forward with this. But managing, moving and restoring monuments, whether they're in parochial control or local authority control, is possible if you do this sort of notification process. You can't easily persuade families that don't want to be persuaded to contribute financially towards the maintenance and conservation of monuments which are technically theirs. But you can get permission either explicitly or indirectly, by no one complaining otherwise. So that and for example, in East Riding, there's quite a few churches, East Riding of Yorkshire, quite a few churches that have passed into local authority control, and they have a very impressive system of monitoring those churchyards and a programme of works that do restoration. On the laying the stones flat, which is something which may come up for all of you as part of a process of health and safety with these churchyards, laying them flat face down means that you preserve the inscription, means they're not readable at that moment, but it does mean they survive in the long term. If you leave them inscription face up, you are very likely in a relatively few years to see notable degradation of the designs and the text because of water settling in the stone. It depends on the geology, but it's usually one of these things. Either they dissolve away if they're limestone, or they have sort of freeze-thaw action on them, and bits chip off and break up and people also walk on them. Many of you may have have memorials in your paths, and you'll see that those get worn. So the face down is actually the best conservation method, but obviously having recorded and photographed the inscribed face means that people who are interested in that memorial can see what it's like. But if you leave it inscribed face up, then it won't be there for a terribly long time in a good state of preservation. And I have plenty of examples of memorials where the grass has grown over them. They're ledger stones and the grass has grown over them, and the middle is all eroded. And then if you pull back the grass at the edge and reveal the rest, it's absolutely perfectly preserved. And so you can really see the difference between the exposed areas of a memorial, of the very same memorial, and the parts that have been covered over. So putting it face down or is a way of making sure that the monument is kept intact. Obviously, the ideal would be to reset it vertically, and that can be done quite easily by a contractor. And if you want to know how to do it, or how to reset and make more vertical ones that are leaning alarmingly, I recommend Historic Scotland's online downloadable PDFs on some of these things. They have some very good advice documents there. They've taken a long interest, long before England or Wales were interested in memorials and how to preserve them and manage them. Historic Scotland had a considerable interest. So I recommend their various documents on that. They are, I would say, the world, well, the European leaders. There are some North American state advice documents that are actually excellent, but they have most of them have rather different memorials to ours that they're concerned about. So Historic Scotland's the place to go. It's now called Historic Environment Scotland, I think, but the documents will have been produced while they were Historic Scotland. They've combined the equivalent of English Nature and Historic England together in one organisation in Scotland. So that's why they've changed their name. So that's a tip for some of those practical sort of elements for resetting stones and so on. Should you need to know that as part of your wider management plan. It's not part of my recording process, but it's part of that plan. Also, talking about those monuments that might have to be moved because of the building work or whatever's going on in the churchyard, that's again another example of why a historic map showing where they were, and with them all being photographed, and with them all being recorded using my forms, which has all sorts of information about them, not just the inscriptions which the genealogy people probably have collected, means that you have a much more robust record should anything happen to any of them than before. Okay.
Okay, I think we're
yeah. Okay.
Just thinking.
I was just going to say, someone's just said that you need a faculty to lay down moors, and that's certainly true. So you don't need a faculty to do your survey because you're not physically changing anything, but you do need a faculty is needed if you're going to lay some flat, or if you're going to move some, or you're going to do anything else. So that's so faculties are something which some parishes are very good about getting, and certainly some parishes seem to think it's a bureaucratic stage they can do without. I hope none of you are in that category and realise that actually the diocese can have within the faculty jurisdiction system some very good advice for you from people who are on that committee. So that's something to bear in mind. Okay, back to Andrea, sorry. You're muted. There we are, Andrea.
There you go. Am I still echoey? I'm a bit echoey here.
You're a bit echoey, but that gives it an extra aura, Andrea. It makes you sort of, okay. You're not under one of those gravestones, are you?
Not yet, thank you. So, yeah, I'm just wondering if we're nearly coming to the end of our time. So is there any other questions that people have for Harold before we wrap up? and think about the next steps. I'm just glancing through to see any hands up. No. So Harold, your offer of maybe having a nice support group of counselling for those of us trying to record our memorials in the future might be great, actually, because like I say, sort of maybe a quarter of people here have actually gone out with the forms by the look of what hands were up and actually done some, tried out the forms. And like you say, once people actually try out the forms, that's when the questions pop up. So should we kind of keep in touch with everybody and then maybe schedule a support group Zoom call in maybe a month's time? I presume that everybody's kind of doing local burial grounds, so they might be able to get out to them within a month, or people actually needing to travel, therefore waiting for the end of lockdown. I'm not sure. Does a month sound about right to people? Do you want to pop up your hands or nod a yes?
Maybe not a bit longer.
Maybe a bit longer. Okay.
Maybe a bit longer.
6 weeks. Anybody? 6 weeks. Bit of an awkward.
Yeah. Let's try 6 weeks, and then we can see where we are from there. And what I'll do is I'll get this logistics, which is mainly for doing it with groups, which of course may not be possible at the moment, but some of it is also, you may be able to, in effect, as a group do it, but not necessarily do it at the same time. So a group of you may be all sharing doing a survey, but you can't all turn up at the same time. So there may be a way in which, you know, a group of you can collaborate to get something started. Now, clearly, it's not the best weather at the moment, and as Tim was saying with the light, sometimes this time of year you can have fantastic light, but often it's, I'm looking out the window now, and this is not a good moment to be doing any graveyard recording. You know, they'll all seem like they haven't got any scripts on at the moment. So you need to, you know, choose your time. But on the other hand, there are various preliminaries, including sort of scoping it all out and so on, and getting some of the memorials done that are very easy to do, that you can do at this time of year. And as I say, if the light is right, these clear winter days can be fantastic for revealing things. And of course, the vegetation is down. So some of you maybe ought to be thinking of sort of getting all wrapped up and out for some of your graveyards where you know that when it comes to the summer, all the stuff that Andrea gets excited about will have all grown up and will be all in full leaf and everything. And you won't be able to get a good photograph of the stone. The light won't be casting, you know, a nice oblique angle on it. It'll all be in dappled sunlight, which is absolutely the worst thing. Nothing, and you can't take a photograph in dappled sunlight. Sometimes with flash you can sort of get rid of it. You know, sometimes the winter can be a time when aspects can be done. So you might want to go there and think about, what should I do when? That's the advantage of local people doing it over the long term, is that you can actually pick and choose when you do what, so that you can do the easy ones when it's, you know, not very good conditions. And then when you get the right conditions, you home in on the ones that are going to be more problematic. And also you've got more experience. I always recommend you start with some of the easiest ones. Is Dinky going to say something? We thought we were going to get a question there. We got a question? No. So do think about that in terms of how you might plan your time. I think that's part of what you can do this time of year, even if you can't get a full-blooded group out there working together because of COVID. You can at least do some of the preparatory stuff and perhaps do bits and pieces individually yourselves and begin to get them started. Okay, so does that answer that particular question or point for Andrea? So yeah. We'll come back and we'll have another your and see where you're all doing. It's good to try and it's worth having these meetings, if only to keep us all going and try and encourage us to get out there and do it. You'll find it slow to start with. Those of you who've done a few forms will have found them quite slow to start with, but you will speed up. Okay, some of our students end up dreaming these codes. Okay, Whether you'll end up that obsessed, I don't know. But when they've done it for 2 weeks running, they know them all, most of the codes that they're likely to come across by heart. They're identifying them at 20 paces. It just becomes sort of really easy. It's a bit like learning to drive a car. It all seems too complicated at first, but then gradually, it becomes almost second nature, a lot of it. So just keep plodding away, and that's another reason why you need to sort of keep getting in the rhythm and doing it, and you'll soon start having that ring binder of forms filling up, and then you'll get that wonderful sense of achievement. Okay, you can chip away and get it all done.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Harold. That is really great, and thank you to everybody who's turned up today and who'll be off out there on their daily walk, peering over their churchyard wall. Also, thank you to the lottery players who've, because the Heritage Lottery Fund has helped us get the webinars off the ground, because it has enabled needed technology and things like that. So thanks to the lottery players for their support. You've got Anna's email address, so if you do need anything in the meantime, any help in the meantime, between now and 6 weeks, then do just contact us. We've got more webinars planned. They're more, the next ones are a run of ecology based ones that will be myself, and also various other experts will be brought in as well, like Harold, but the biological side. So we hope to see you again if you're interested in that side of things. But thank you very much, Harold. Really appreciate these 3 lectures. They've been really great. If I could choose
okay, and thank you all of you for participating today. I think it's much better that there's a sort of bottom-up approach when we got to this stage, because it also makes me realise what I may need to cover when I'm doing, introductory talks elsewhere, or a rerun of this series, if there's anything. But a lot of you seem to be coping so far. You need to get out to see whether it all actually seems too complicated in the end, and you need some more advice and encouragement. So do try and get out there. Now the snow's melted, well, it has here anyway. You can see all those memorials. You just need to be all wrapped up and ready for action. Okay, nice seeing everybody.